Hello and welcome back to another episode of Only a Bag, the guide to Italian travel. I'm Nathaniel Mellor, and once again I will be doing this podcast alone, even though last week wasn't really a podcast. It was just a minute and a half of me saying we won't be here. Darcy is still recovering as she's still kind of prone to bouts of coughing, and she still has a bit of a fever, so she is still on bed rest and will probably be on bed rest for the foreseeable future, which only means, it means a lot of things, but to you, our dear listeners, it means that instead of recording a bunch of episodes before we go back to the States in a week, we will probably just be taking our microphones with us and recording when we are there. That way we can maintain our weekly Wednesday schedule. And if you are listening for the first time, first off, welcome. Thank you for being here. And if you want to get a really good feel of how the podcast actually sounds, I do encourage you to listen to one of the previous episodes. Maybe not the last episode, because that's just me talking for a minute and a half, but one of the episodes where Darcy is actually participating, because it's probably going to sound a lot better than this one. So I do apologize now if you'd give me some leeway. I realize I've mentioned, I think, in a few episodes past that I talk pretty quickly, so I'm trying to slow down for this episode because there is no one else to bounce my conversation off of. There's no conversation. It's just more going to be a monologue. So I'm going to try to speak a little slower because I don't have Darcy on the other side of the table telling me to slow down. So thank you so much for your patience. And like I said, if you are joining us for the first time, thank you. We appreciate having you here. If you'd like to, you can follow us. It does help the show out tremendously. You can also check us out on onlyabag.com. It's our website. It has some articles, blog posts, information, things that maybe you want to like bookmark rather than, read once. If it's more about like if you missed your train or, is Rome safe to walk around at night, that kinds of thing. We also have an Instagram at onlyabagpodcast. You can follow us there. And we have an email at onlyabagpodcast@gmail.com. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or if there's anything we touched on that you would like more information about. You can also leave us a comment on Spotify in just down below if you're listening on Spotify, and we will respond to your comment there. If you leave us reviews on Apple or anywhere else, we really genuinely deeply appreciate it. And we just want to say that we can't actually respond to reviews, so there's no way for us to say thank you so much for listening. But I just here and now, I do want to say thank you so much for listening and thank you so much for leaving reviews. It is always amazing when we check and realize that, oh my God, somebody left us a review. Somebody's enjoying the show. So thank you so much for doing that. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode, which is going to be on travel insurance versus travel health insurance. Which do you need? Which is better? Which is perfect for your trip? Which is best for your trip? And at the very end, I do want to touch briefly. I am long-winded even by myself, but I do want to touch briefly on prescriptions and how to get prescriptions filled in Italy, especially for those of you who are maybe long-term traveling. This is not going to be your first or final destination. You might be on the road for 6 months. It's also especially important for digital nomads, which is something we're going to talk about in a later episode. But for those digital nomads who do need to refill your prescription, how do you do it in Italy? There will also be some affiliate links in the description for insurance as well as for Booking and Expedia. I do want to just go ahead and throw out now that I highly, highly, highly recommend that you treat this as a jumping off point for travel insurance, that you don't use this as the end-all be-all of travel insurance, because as we're going to learn, or as you're going to learn, as I've already learned, the travel insurance is different. Like everybody has a different need when it comes to travel insurance. So I might put an affiliate link in the description that might not be right for you. So I do encourage you strongly to go and find one that works for you. But if you'd like to support the channel, you can use the affiliate links in the description, especially we've mentioned before, but if you're going to Rome next year, already VRBOs, Airbnbs, booking, hotels, all of that is already being filled up, is already being booked up because people are already planning these trips. So if you'd like to go ahead and secure your spot in Rome, you can do so below. You can use our affiliate links. It'll help us the show at no extra cost to you. So let's get started. What is travel insurance? And broadly speaking, travel insurance is essentially just what it sounds like. It's insurance for your trip. It is often broken into two different categories: insurance for your trip and then insurance for yourself while you're on your trip, which is travel health insurance. Often, not always, but often, the travel insurance will include a component of travel health insurance. And before we get into that, I do want to focus more on the travel insurance, because the travel health insurance can get a little, I don't know the word, it can be a little complicated potentially. It can be a little, I'm going to try to boil it down to its basics, because I don't think anyone wants to listen to, 25 minutes on copays and deductibles. And if you do, I'm happy to deliver that. Let me know. But we're going to focus more on just the general broad overview, what travel health insurance can do for you, and more specifically, what it cannot do for you. So travel insurance is, at its core, something you've probably seen before on Delta, or even like on Booking, on Expedia. Right before you get to the final checkout page, there will be usually a little box that says, would you like to insure this trip? And I think the price is typically like maybe $100, $200 per person. Sometimes it's cheaper if you're doing a domestic flight, sometimes more expensive if you're doing a longer international flight. It also, I think, depends on, I'm guessing, actually, I should say, depends on the class of trip you purchased. I'm assuming if you're first class, you probably pay a little bit more because they rebook you on a first class ticket than somebody who's economy like myself. I'm not entirely sure on that. It doesn't seem to be very clearly listed. So if that's the case, please let me know. And what that travel insurance does is, as it says, it will cover your trip. But there's kind of some caveats here. See, if Darcy were here, she would tell me how to pronounce that word. Caveats? I'm going to say caveats and hope for the best there. And that is, as we've mentioned in booking a flight or how to choose a flight, when you are flying from Europe on any carrier, you have certain protections. And when you're flying to Europe on a European carrier, you have certain protections. And those protections are things like if the flight is delayed, or if the flight is canceled, or if for some reason you have to stay the night, they will put you up in an airport, they will give you a food voucher, and they will get you on the next flight free of charge. Sometimes, and this is where it gets a little tricky, sometimes you are also eligible for a reimbursement of the cost of the flight, the fare. However, I think it's one of those things where in practice, that's how it works, or excuse me, in theory, that's how it works. In practice, it doesn't, because if a flight is pushed because of weather, then they don't actually have to reimburse you. So one thing that we found, or we all saw a few months ago, I think it's called CrowdStrike. That's that cybersecurity company that caused a lot of Windows computers to just blue screen. And, we saw these stories about how airlines were like writing out tickets by hand, and people were just getting passed through security without the security actually working. And that was, all due to this cybersecurity company basically put out this update that crashed these computers. And something that a lot of airlines did was say, well, no, the flight's not taking off because of weather. It has nothing to do with that. So they weren't reimbursing people, even while people in the terminals were on their phones on the news, USA Today or The Guardian or whatever it was, saying, no, there's an article, your company has just said because of, I think it's called CrowdStrike, cybersecurity, this flight isn't taking off. And now you're telling me that it's because of weather, so I'm not going to get reimbursed. Caused a whole kerfuffle. And I think they eventually, some of these passengers did get reimbursed. But what I took from that, the lesson I learned from this story, is that oftentimes I think that the airline companies will default into this was a weather-related issue and not a plane-related issue or a scheduling conflict or something else like that. A strike in I think I flew over France once, and the air traffic control tower was striking, and it was only for 15, 25 minutes, but it was enough that it made every flight late. And because, again, it wasn't the airline's fault, technically, then we were not reimbursed for the late flight or the missed flights afterwards. However, because this was in Europe, even though we weren't reimbursed, we were still rebooked free of charge on other flights. So that all being said is sometimes if you book your flight from the States, and again, I'm saying that as if you, my dear listener, are from the States. If you're not from the States, if you're from Australia or England or anywhere else in the world and you like to listen to English-speaking podcasts, then anytime you book on an European carrier going to Europe, then you should be covered. if you leave Europe on any carrier, you should be covered. So if you're leaving, let's say, Europe on Delta, you're covered. But if you arrive on Delta, you're not. If you arrive on KLM or Air France, you are. So all that being said is sometimes some of the travel insurance is redundant. It isn't necessary in the sense that, I mean, if you rented a car, you might have found that out as well. Like, you can't use your credit card's auto collision waiver. I think it's something like that is what it's called. You can't use that insurance and the rental car company. They force you to choose one of the two, and then you waive the other one, basically. I have learned our lesson, or we have learned our lesson, but it's just me here. I have learned my lesson, and I'm no longer going to be using our credit cards rental collision insurance. I'll probably just be using the car company's collision insurance from now on, because we used our credit cards and it was fine. I mean, it worked really well. There was no problems with the credit card, but they don't reimburse the tax on it. And because we're in Italy, it's like a 22% tax. So it was end up being 180, 190 euros they did not reimburse, which makes perfect sense. And it was just like kind of expensive because the rental car company would have reimbursed it. So I'm clearly getting off topic here. See, this is why Darcy's important for a lot of reasons, but also because she keeps me on task. And otherwise, I'm just going to be monologuing off on random tangents, trying to edit myself back together. So moving forward, there are very helpful travel insurance options out there. The one that you can find when you're booking your flight is honestly quite helpful if you have the money and if there is a sense of uncertainty when it comes to your flight. Darcy and I have learned to book only main cabin. At least that's what Delta calls it. I think it's called maybe like economy flex, I think with KLM, and I think Air France has something similar where you have a changeable ticket and a refundable ticket, or at least Delta, it's not refundable to cash unless you pay like $300 more. It's refundable to a Delta E credit, which is, I don't know, like the same thing as cash if you use it on delta.com. That has provided a lot of comfort for us, I would say. It's provided a way for us to book a flight without feeling like if something were to happen, we can't do anything. We either have to lose the money or, we're out of luck, basically. So we started doing these changeable tickets, and within 24 hours of the flight leaving, they are changeable for only the change in cost. However, it's not always a fee. We often, sometimes there'll be free days, like you can change it to, from a Thursday to Thursday for free, because it's just the same, the flight is the same cost. We've also seen where we'll gain $32 in e-credit or on Delta e-credit by changing to a cheaper day. I say 32 because that was specifically one of the ones we saw was 32. It's not like a standard 32. And I think you can't, the only thing is I don't think you can change your ticket and change your class. I think if you're economy, you have to change to economy. If you're first, you have to change to first. I don't think you can go from like first down to economy and get the rest back as an e-credit. So there are some stipulations involved. However, one of the reasons we have not found travel insurance around flights very specifically helpful is because, again, if you book on the right kind of carrier and if you get the right kind of ticket, it's often better than trying to get the insurance and dealing with a third party after the fact. If my Delta flight is late, I can go to the counter and talk to Delta. If I don't have a changeable ticket, if I didn't book on a European carrier or something like that, like KLM, Air France, then I'd have to talk to Allianz or whoever is their underwriter for their insurance, and that can take weeks or months while I'm just waiting to get my money back. The other things that you can cover, they being the travel insurance, it can cover things like lost baggage. This will often just be a flat amount of money, so double check that and do not at all put any valuables in your checked bag. This is like one of our biggest. I don't think we have any travel tips really like that are like insane, mind-blowing, except for, the basics, and that is do not ever put valuables in a checked baggage. For one thing, it's just there are times where people will walk off with your bag, not necessarily to steal it, but assuming it's theirs. If it's it's a black Delsey, and there's a lot of black Delseys, it's like, oh, that's my bag, and they'll take it and not realize that it's not theirs until they get back to their hotel or their house and realize that, ooh, I didn't have an iPad 8 hours ago. I now have an iPad. That's weird. And then, of course, there are stories of the TSA will go, they'll put that little note, your bag has been randomly searched by the TSA, blah, 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 blah. And some people have said, I had an iPad in here, and then the TSA searched it and they took the iPad, and they left me a little note saying, we confiscated because whatever, it was a battery or something like that. Like it couldn't be in your checked baggage, but they didn't give it back to me. They just took my iPad. They just took my computer or whatever it is. So I personally have a lot of fear around putting valuables in a checked bag. And the reason that's important here is because when your, let's just say your bag goes missing, they'll only give you a flat rate, 250, 350. I think the most I've seen is 500. You might be able to find something more than that. But if you're traveling with a nice piece of luggage, like if you're, I think Rimowa makes that aluminum sided luggage, it's a beautiful, beautiful luggage, but it's about $1,000 for aluminum hard sided carry on, and that's so them offering you 500 is not even offering the cost of the luggage, let alone any clothes you might have within it. So it's not a bad option, this lost baggage thing, but you can only use it after, I think, 24 hours or 48 hours. You can't use it like when you arrive and you don't see your bag there. You can't, it doesn't go into effect, I think, until about 24 to 48 hours after they've lost your bag, which makes sense. It gives them time to find the bag first. And once they have, of course, like once that time has passed, then you just get, I think, your money back. But again, with the cost of luggage, with the cost of just, even like a jacket, you put your North Face jacket, you put a Patagonia jacket, something else where it's not like a particularly fancy brand, it's not like a high fashion brand, but it's still a $300 jacket into a $200 piece of luggage, that's already $500 there. That doesn't include the shoes and the underwear and the socks and the shirts and the pants and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and while it is something, I mean, obviously it's 500 is better than nothing, to be absolutely clear. I know that people have had good luck with using air tags inside of their luggage, just in case their luggage goes missing. They can go to the baggage claim person and be like, here's where it is. Can you get on the phone with, Charles de Gaulle or Venice or Florence or wherever it is and call them and say, have you seen a black bag? Can you please send it to Rome or send it to Atlanta or, wherever you're flying to? And that has yielded potentially more results because at least you do get your bag back. But again, for me, it's not. We often travel without any checked bags whatsoever, so it kind of is like, it doesn't make sense, at least for us. And if you're traveling as a family, a couple, and you are bringing checked bags, it's not a bad option. Again, though, this is always my sort of just not even paranoia, but safety minded. Maybe it's paranoia, but it's I do want to make sure that I don't have anything I'm not willing to lose in my roller bag, in my checked bag. And apart from that, so you have baggage, you have missed flights, you have, and some of them do cover too, I should add, they do cover if you get sick beforehand and you can't make it. They also cover sometimes if somebody has passed away in your family and you can't make it because you need to attend a funeral or you're grieving. There are certain clauses in there that allow that. However, again, I do urge you to double check those clauses because sometimes I'm like, it's the weirdest thing. I mean, not weird, I guess, if you're an insurance company, but a person might find it weird. I find it weird, I should say, is that like if somebody passes away in your family, it has to be grandparents, sibling, children, or parent. It can't be aunt, uncle. It can't be stepchildren. It can't be step parents. It's a very narrow thing. So it's even, and I say that too. I'm hopefully you're not traveling before somebody's going to pass away, ideally. And at the same time, I know that that's sometimes you just have a trip coming up, and all of a sudden someone gets sick, and it's sort of like, do we cancel? There are times out there. I'm gesturing with my hands because I'm sort of trying to figure out a version in which this works, but I'm sure you understand. See, this is why I feel like I do not do well as a solo host. I'm just sort of rambling. But getting back on subject, being back on topic, there's, like I mentioned too, there's also if you get sick, and sometimes that only covers certain types of sickness. So you might not feel well enough to travel, but your insurance company will say, well, you kind of should be well enough to travel. There's, you don't have the flu, COVID, or I think there's usually a few other things in there, but it's like you have, potentially some sort of like tooth infection or something like that, where you're like, I'm in so much pain, I cannot travel. Then they're like, well, that's really unfortunate. You should have bought a different ticket. So all that being said is before you book travel insurance through like Delta or Booking or whatever it is, double check those agreements to make sure what you are getting is actually helpful for you. Or if it isn't, then you can always go on to different websites, different travel insurance websites like, World Nomad, Alliance Travel, Generali, which is actually an Italian insurance company, and try to find other more tailored travel insurance plans. And that does very briefly bring me to travel credit cards or just credit cards in general. I know we talk about them frequently. if you've spent like any time at all on TripAdvisor or Ricksteves or Reddit or anything like that where there's a travel forum, this is something that's probably obviously encouraged heavily, is use a credit card. I mean, again, I do want to repeat, I'm saying this as like just somebody who is not a financial advisor, so don't take this please as any sort of financial advice. It's just, we have noticed that credit cards have a lot of insurance and a lot of protection built into them for a variety of things, whether it's, somebody stole your card information, fraud. Sometimes they'll even have, if you buy a phone or something like that with a credit card, there's already an automatic like 2 or 3 year insurance on that. I've mentioned before with Capital One, when we book through their Capital One travel platform, Darcy and I get a lot of protection there. We get price drop protection just on the flights. If there's a canceled flight, we get protected there. If there's a baggage loss, we get protected there. So I mean, I don't think it covers sickness actually, except I think that some of the nicer ones do. We have a super basic Capital One Quicksilver. It's $0 a year, so we feel like it's a good travel credit card because it's not a commitment. It gives us, I think 2.5% cash back. It has no foreign transaction fees. I feel like I'm doing an ad, but the point is, it does for no cost to us in the sense of, if we use it to buy the flight and then immediately pay it back, so no insurance built up on it, no cost to us, it can protect the trip, and that is a huge sort of like just weight off our shoulders. When we buy it with our debit cards, when we buy the flights with our debit card, it's just this like, I don't know, it feels just like it feels like basically a lot of airline companies are sort of not the most flexible in the world. So they sort of, if anything were to happen, they're just like, you have no protection. You should have gotten the insurance. You're out of luck. Sorry. And it seems like with a credit card, you can kind of ask them to like, can you just go fight this for me? Like I'll be your customer for years if you just go and, you send your lawyers at their lawyers, because I can't afford lawyers. So we do often, that's one of the reasons we do often recommend credit cards. And the same reason a lot of like, if you go to traveling subreddits, digital nomad subreddits, or forums or things like that, often people will be like, do not travel without one. At the very least, book your hotel, book your flight, because if something happens to those, you can always call your credit card and explain what happened. And they should cover for you in the sense of they could reimburse you, or they could just get you on a new flight. They could get you a new hotel room, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that being said, that is one of the reasons we suggest using credit cards so much, and the same reason that so many other long-term / world travelers suggest credit cards so much. If it remotely is interesting to you, again, I apologize for that sounding like an ad, like a weird little mid-roll ad, but there will be an affiliate link, not even an affiliate link, it's a refer a friend link, I think, in the description for the Capital One Quicksilver card. If you spend $500 in the first 3 months, you get $200 cash back as a little like credit, I guess, a little cashback credit, but it goes on your, it takes basically $200 off your statement, so it's essentially cash. And it's quite helpful because if you have a trip coming up, it does take $200 off your flight or off your hotel room or whatever it is. It's a one-time offer type thing, so it's only when you sign up for it. But again, one of the reasons we like Quicksilver is because there's no yearly fee. So once you sign up for it, you don't have to keep paying it. And yeah, it's kind of a nice little tool. But getting kind of shifting gears a little bit, we're going to talk about travel health insurance. And this is going to be for the rest of the episode until we talk about prescriptions. I say that now because we're, roughly halfway into the episode. So we'll see if I can keep this at 25 minutes. But travel health insurance is potentially really, really important depending on where you're going, depending on how you're traveling, and depending on who you are as a person, depending on your health, I should say, as a person. And again, I have this all written down, so I'm going to try not to sound completely monotone as I read it. And we're going to see how that works. But essentially, travel health insurance rather, is typically broken up into 2 different categories, standalone and comprehensive. Comprehensive includes that travel insurance, the general travel insurance we talked about before, the baggage insurance, the missed flight, missed connection, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's standalone, which is just your medical coverage. If you are American, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to do this, is for Americans, because we have, I think, are arguably some of the worst health insurance options like in the world. I have not been to a lot of the other parts of the world. If you're listening from Australia, you might be thinking, oh no, wait till you come to Australia. We have terrible health insurance. I've heard, mixed reviews about Canadian health insurance. Some people say it's amazing, but some people say it's impossible to get, an appointment. So staying away from too many broad generalizations, I do think that American health insurance is quite complicated and expensive. And most importantly, if you are planning a trip, by and large, your health insurance in America will not cover anything outside of America. And I think that's really important because, I don't know, you're paying a lot of money. It should cover like a trip to Canada or a trip to Mexico or maybe a trip to Italy, but specifically Canada and Mexico. And it doesn't often do that. So that is where health insurance, or rather travel health insurance, comes in. And just the first thing I want to say right off the bat is it tends to be a lot cheaper than your regular health insurance. However, the caveat, is that how I think I've settled on caveat? The caveat here is that you pretty much cannot get anything elective done. It's almost always for emergencies. It's not a stand-in for your actual health insurance. So that's just a really important thing. If you're thinking about like Italy as health tourism, travel health insurance will not help you in the same way like just having money will. And I do want to get into that in another episode, just the idea of Italy as a destination for health tourism, because it's not often mentioned. But what you are going to typically find with health insurance, travel health insurance, is, and I'm probably going to refer to as health insurance, by the way, for the rest of this episode, and just so in case you keep hearing health insurance, I do mean while you're abroad, and don't mean while you're in the States or in your home country. So the health insurance will typically include ambulance costs. If you call the ambulance, they'll pay for it. It typically includes the doctor and hospital visits, the bills, the OR, like the operating room. And if you had, hopefully you do not have to be in an operating room, but if you do, it should cover those. It should cover any x-rays, treatments, drugs, tests, lab results, all that kind of stuff should all be covered. And then it should cover dental. But this is, again, going back to that first thing I mentioned. It's not an elective thing. It only covers emergency dental. And before you get it, look at what it says. Because when I looked in the past, and the reason I've never gotten travel dental insurance is because it's really only for like you broke a tooth or you, that's usually kind of it. It's got inflamed and got infected somehow. I don't even think, and I say that as somebody, I have a crown on my front tooth. I've had it for way too long. Like, I think they're only supposed to last like 10 to 15 years. I'm going on like year 20 at this point. So it's a little old, and it's still doing quite well. And I found that it doesn't necessarily cover, if it breaks while I'm traveling, it doesn't cover that as, as a thing. It usually, it only covers like things that could potentially lead to something deadly. And apparently, I guess, a crown breaking or popping off does not lead to anything deadly. So that is just the basics of what it will cover. And typically, again, I'm going to speak in typically, and then I want to get into depth a little bit, but typically it will not include any medical evacuation. So if you are hiking, or if you're scuba diving, if you're skiing in the Dolomites, the Dolomiti, if you're doing any like spelunking, if you're doing anything like that, it should not, unfortunately, the base travel insurance for most people, health insurance rather, for most people, will not cover medical evacuations. So that helicopter ride will still be out of pocket. Again, I'll get into that a little bit more in depth in a minute. But it's also important to know primary versus secondary healthcare. You're in the States, you have one healthcare, that's your primary healthcare. And then when you buy travel health insurance, that becomes your secondary healthcare. When you leave the States, typically how it works is that the doctor, the hospital, whatever it is, will try to run this through your primary healthcare first, which will be if you're in the States, again, whatever you pay for, Blue Cross, Blue Shield, or Anthem, or whatever it is. And then if they can't, because again, they typically cannot, because nothing is covered. I think even Medicare, nothing is covered outside the States. Maybe like there's a few things very, very specific. Then it defaults into your health insurance, your travel health insurance, and that becomes your primary for all intents and purposes. It's not that important. You don't have to remember this too much, but sometimes there are some sticky situations out there where, again, they're like, well, that wasn't supposed to be your primary. That was supposed to be your secondary, yada, yada, yada. It's always important to just double check the fine print when buying travel health insurance for any reason. So there are also a lot of things that are not typically covered. Like I said, I've already mentioned like elective dental things, but pre-existing conditions are not typically covered under certain health travel insurance, like Alliance is health insurance. you can, once you purchase your flight and your health insurance, if you tell them within 14 days that you have an underlying condition or pre-existing condition, then you will get covered for it. But if you don't, then it won't. Some health insurance, some travel health insurance won't even cover pre-existing conditions at all. And this is especially important because a lot of, at least to my knowledge, last time I looked into this, a lot of insurance companies in America will consider being pregnant as a pre-existing condition, and they will not cover certain anything health emergencies that comes up if you're pregnant. And that is something that's also not covered by a lot of health insurance while traveling, is if you unexpectedly give birth, that's not covered, or not even unexpectedly if you're traveling and you're 9 months pregnant and you sort of somewhat expectedly give birth, that the cost of that is not covered. So these are, I know it's, again, these are kind of silly things, not silly, they're important, but they're like potentially unlikely things if you're just going to Italy for, a week or two. But I don't know, I'm always like, with the whole idea of Only a Bag, is trying to get people prepared to travel in a way that hopefully they don't end up surprised by something, especially something serious, so that we did want to kind of cover as much of this as possible. Other things that are not covered are intoxication or drug use. And that means specifically like not just alcohol poisoning or overdosing, but if you are drunk and then you fall and hit your head, if you fall off a balcony and broke your leg, if you, anything that comes because you are intoxicated, you are not covered. In this, again, little caveat here, you should absolutely check to see what they consider intoxicated. We've mentioned before, and again, one day we'll go into it more in depth in a driving episode, but Italy has a much, much, much lower tolerance for driving while drunk than America does. It's something like, I think, a half or a third of the blood alcohol level that you can drive in America, that will be illegal in Italy, if that makes sense. I think like one beer in Italy is pretty much like, that's there, a glass of wine. But if you have 2 beers, and people here like will have 2 beers, but then they'll have to wait an hour before driving because they don't want to get pulled over, even though they're very much still sober. Italy has a very low tolerance for blood alcohol level while driving. So you have to double check to see if how tolerant or intolerant that blood alcohol level is for your coverage. Because again, nobody wants to have a glass of wine at dinner, walk home, stumble, twist, and potentially break their ankle, and then have it not covered because they had a glass of wine at dinner. You're in Italy. Of course, you're having a glass of wine at dinner. The other things that are not covered, transplants. I'm not sure if you're going to come to Italy to get a transplant, but they don't help that. Anything that's elective, they don't. Typically, anything elective, you can absolutely have elective procedures done in Italy, but it's not covered by health insurance, travel health insurance. Eyeglasses, eye exams, contacts, things like that, not covered either typically. Vaccines, immunizations, also not covered. Again, you can buy them privately for yourself if you wanted to, but they are not covered typically not covered under any travel health insurance. And besides that, I think that's pretty much it. That's the important things. Each travel health insurance company will not cover other things specifically. And one thing, again, I want to mention too is because I briefly said I'll touch on this later, is the medical evacuation. For people who are going to go splunking and skiing and scuba diving, or any of the S words, I guess, hiking, which is not an S word, anything that might require a emergency evacuation, a helicopter or a boat, Coast Guard boat, or anything like that. So there are some health insurances specifically that do cover like adventure traveling, basically, which can be super, super, super important if you are going to a place where, again, sometimes the health insurance is not, or the health system is not very comprehensive. They might only have one, high-level trauma center rather than multiple around the country. So if if you're basically getting in an accident kind of far away from where that place might be, you might need to be airlifted either to that trauma center or to a nearby country's trauma center. We have a friend in Italy who she ended up breaking her hip, and it was something where essentially they had to fly her to Switzerland because that was, every other hospital was like, we are booked right now. And it was somehow there's an emergency involved in this. And so they ended up flying her to Switzerland to have it fixed, and then flew her back home to the UK. And that was all because, again, health insurance, travel health insurance. So it can be very, very important, very, very useful if you are coming to Italy and you're thinking about hiking, if you're thinking about skiing, if you're thinking about sailing maybe, and you're not sure, how it's going to go. It's not a bad idea to get travel health insurance, to get that coverage, that medical evacuation coverage, a very high amount, because they usually cover like 100,000 euros, 500,000 euros, or €1,000,000, depending on how much you pay for the package. And it's one of those things, of course, you don't need it until you need it, in which case you very much need it. I know, because a lot of travelers will not travel with health insurance. They're like, I don't need it. And it's sort of like, yeah, no one does until you broke your leg, then you need it. Which does bring me to just, again, some sort of hypotheticals. I know that when people come to Italy, a lot of it is, you want to do stuff like you want to ride the scooters or maybe rent a Vespa or something like that. And you can absolutely, crash on those, on the Vespa, or somebody can kind of hit you gently and it can break a leg, it can break an ankle. So when you have travel health insurance, that's covered. I know that we've mentioned this in a past episode, specifically the Siena episode, but around the town of Siena, which is built on a hill, there are little defibrillators. That is not an easy word to say. I think it is, just not for me. There are defibrillators around town for people who are experiencing a cardiac episode or having a heart attack. I'm not entirely sure what you use a defibrillator for, to be honest, because I feel like all I know is from house, and I don't think they use it properly in house, because I feel like I read articles where stop using a defibrillator like you see in royal pains and in house. So I really don't know how to use one, but they are around town. And sometimes it's important for people who do have any pre-existing or underlying heart conditions to absolutely have health insurance that will cover them when they're at the doctor's, or they go to the hospital, or they have to get medication, or they have to get an exam or a test to make sure that everything's okay after hiking up a hill. And of course, respiratory issues. That one is, again, it's kind of, after COVID, I think it became a little bit more on the forefront, because people, especially people with long COVID, or anyone who just had a bout of COVID that was really bad, had respiratory issues for a few weeks to a few months later. And we've mentioned this in the summer. It can be very difficult to breathe in Rome when it's 112, 115 degrees outside, and you're just, you're sucking in air and there's nothing happening. And so if you have underlying respiratory issues, they can absolutely get worse. Even if you don't, it's a bad time to find out that you actually have asthma or you actually have some sort of breathing condition. So those are the classic coverages. When a lot of people go traveling, that's this is what you should get checked. This is what you should get kind of covered for. We've mentioned dental, or I've mentioned dental. In Italy, apart from certain people, everybody pays for dental work. I say certain people, it's under certain incomes, over certain ages. There are other certain brackets in which you don't pay for dental, but by and large, everybody pays for their dental work, whether it's a cleaning or a cavity or a crown or something like that. And it's typically a little cheaper to go public, which means going to the hospital to get it done, but it can sometimes take months to get an appointment. Especially if you're in a place that only has one, we live in a place that has one, maybe two hospitals within an hour drive. One hospital within an hour drive, one hospital within an hour and 15-minute drive. And, so there's only two options if I really want dental work done at the hospital. So it's cheaper usually to go private, because there are a lot of private practices where we live, which is all to say, if you have a dental emergency, you can absolutely, and this is something we know a lot of people who travel through, and we've met people who travel through, and we'll help them even organize, if they did crack a tooth and they don't have insurance, or they did, sometimes it's just discovering they had a cavity, not realizing they have a cavity until they're eating something sweet, and they're like, oh my God, there's an intense pain in my mouth. There are absolutely dental offices that have appointments every day, and you can go and get a cavity filled. They can try to repair a cracked tooth. Sometimes, if it's one of those things that takes multiple trips, it can be a little bit more difficult if you're not in a place for an extended period. But again, I want to get into that more in the travel tourism, the health tourism sort of episode. But this is all to say is, if you're coming to Italy and you have any issues with teeth specifically, almost certainly it's going to have to be done privately, which means out of pocket. But just for an example, I think where I am, at least, a standard price to have a cavity filled is about 40 euros. And it doesn't matter if it's, I had one filled in the States actually recently, and apparently it's done by how many sides need to be drilled into. So if it's between two teeth, it's okay, that's technically two sides, plus it's on the front of one tooth. There's 3 sides all of a sudden, and I'm paying, it's supposed to be 110, but it's now 330 because they drill into 3 different sides. But here it's no, it's touching 2 teeth, so it's 40 euros. It doesn't matter if, how much you have to drill into the tooth. The only thing that does obviously change is if it becomes a root canal. But then a root canal typically is only 100, maybe 100 to 200 euros, depending where you go. So all that being said, it's not the end of the world for a lot of people if they have dental issues to get them seen to privately. And again, that can be for you as well. If you're coming here and something happens, you crack a tooth while you're eating something hard, you find out you have a cavity, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of times a dental office will have an appointment, same day or the day later. They can get you in there, fill a cavity, repair a tooth, and get you out for pretty, fairly reasonable sum of money. It's a standard flat rate. And the last thing I want to touch on before moving into prescriptions is the emergency room system or the healthcare system for Italy. There's a lot of in theory versus in practice, I think, when it comes to Italy and healthcare and tourists, in the sense that Italy does require every tourist to have some sort of health coverage. Typically, this means health coverage in the States. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to charge your health insurance back in the States, whatever they do for you in Italy. It just means you can't, again, technically, there's some gray area around traveling to Italy without health insurance. In practice, I've never had an issue. Nobody's ever stopped me. There have been many times in my life where I've had no health insurance because could not afford it. So it became, I could afford a trip to Italy, but not, the $300 a month for health insurance. So it's not like a hard and fast rule. I've also found, again, that when you don't have health insurance and you go to the emergency room, which is, what I'm going to talk about in just a second, they don't typically care that much. It's more about if you have an emergency, you come in, you get seen to, and then if it's not an emergency, you have to pay a nominal fee, usually, or at least in Italy, it starts at 25 euros. In Campania, I think it's capped at 25 euros as well. Other regions are a little bit higher. I think it goes up to 70 or 80 euros. So if you go in because you think you broke your leg and it ends up being that you just bruised it, not an emergency, you have to pay a little bit of money and you're fine. They won't necessarily give you anything for it, but you're fine. If I'm not mistaken, if you go in and you actually did break your leg, they'll see to it, they'll patch you up, they'll put you in a cast, and then they'll send you on your way. So it does depend on where you are. It does depend on your ailment. It depends on a lot of things. If it's essentially, though, the takeaway here is in Italy, oftentimes you can get covered by the emergency room itself. And there's another option called the guarda turistici, which is like the tourist guard, I think. We have a guarda medica, which is kind of like the medical guard. It's like guarda doesn't really translate very well as guard. It kind of means like group, I guess, maybe, or department. And so in a lot of Italian towns, there's something called the guarda medica, which is essentially in the evenings, at night, or on Sunday, this thing will be open. And it's usually one person, and they can give antibiotics, or they can, help maybe do some very, very low-level testing if you think you have an infection or you got hurt or something like that. I don't think they can even set like a leg or, do a cast or anything. It's just for Italians, a free medical service on the off hours when hospitals are closed. The tourists have access to something called the Department of Tourists, the Guarda Turistici, which is the same thing, but for tourists. Essentially, it's like going to your GP back home, but in Italy. This should cover you for essentially anything that you might need in the middle of the night if you are having, again, tightness of breathing, if you are having pain somewhere, anything that you might normally call a doctor for, you can instead call them. You do need health insurance to do so, but again, if you have travel health insurance, that's covered. If you have American health insurance, that should also work just fine there. It's more of just a way of preventing people from traveling to Italy and then using the public service without paying for it. Of course, as mentioned, you can always use a private service and pay for it, and it's, really not that much money at all, except maybe like in larger northern cities like Milan, it might be kind of expensive, but in the south, it's really not at all. But I don't think there are very many, like I think in the States we have like the sort of immediate med or whatever it is, the doctor in a box type thing. There are not a lot of those in Italy. It's a little bit more based on, speciality, and then it's mostly just based on speciality. So it's not a lot of like going somewhere to get like a shot of antibiotics or going somewhere to, I don't know, for them to tell you have the flu and take some pills and get a prescription for an antiviral or something. So it's a little bit more difficult. So just to recap on that, in case I'm all over the place, because again, it's like it makes sense in my head, but I realized it might not make sense out loud. If you don't have travel health insurance, if you just have health insurance, you should still be health insurance in the States or your home country. You should still be covered in emergency rooms. You have to go to a public hospital, not a private hospital. Private hospitals don't typically have emergency rooms or even trauma centers. Only a public hospital will have that. You can ask if you're an Airbnb or a hotel, you can ask them where it is. They will send, if you need an ambulance, they'll call one for you. You can dial 118 if you'd like to call for yourself. Otherwise, you can just walk in. Most emergency rooms, like I mentioned, do close at like 8 in the evening, and that's when you can start using the guarda turistici if you need something after 8 in the evening. Some will be open 24-hour, not often, usually in bigger cities, and only one of them in a bigger city will be open 24 hours. And it might not be the same one. If there's 2 or 3 large public hospitals in a big city, they might have a rotating, Mondays will be this hospital, and then Tuesdays will be another hospital type thing. So that's the big takeaway. If you have an emergency though, always, as Darcy and I have always recommended, go to the emergency room. Absolutely. You have to, you'll still have to pay typically a little small fee. It's not very much. We've taken friends to the emergency room here in where we are. It's like an hour away, and they've never had to pay. It's one person had, again, chest issues and thought, she was having potentially a cardiac episode, ended up not being a cardiac episode. So very thankful for that. But they also didn't charge her because they considered it an emergency. They're like, no, you came for an emergency, even though it ended up not being one. We still qualify that as an emergency. Another person they thought they had some sort of really, really serious sort of infection, sort of like, COVID, or they weren't really sure it was some sort of flu or something, and they went to see if they could get antibiotics, which they did. So if you have any issues when you're traveling, I hope, of course, that you don't. But if you do, if something comes up, if you're walking around and twist your ankle, if you hit your head on something, if you, in the summer, if you're feeling overheated, if you eat something that maybe is not so great, like if you have food poisoning, it's really a good idea to go to a hospital. They will absolutely see to you. I know there are horror stories about like, as soon as they found out I was American, they charged me like 30,000 euros. I've at least never met anybody in my life personally who has happened to. Everyone I've met who's American, or at least just not from Italy or from the EU, who have been to the emergency room, had good experiences as far as getting in, not waiting very long, especially if it's serious. You go to any emergency room with chest pain and you'll be seen to within like 2 minutes. They do not mess with chest pains here. I don't know if they mess with chest pains anywhere, but man, they do not mess with it here. I went once because I thought I had a broken thumb, and they saw to me within like 30 or 45 minutes, which I thought felt pretty good, because I've heard, again, other people going to emergency rooms in other countries and not being seen to for hours. So being seen to for 30 or 45 minutes felt amazing. And this does all kind of bring me very, very quickly, end of the episode, but into prescriptions. Traveling with prescriptions, and most importantly, how do you refill your prescriptions when you're in Italy? So first off, if you take any prescription medication, I highly suggest that you get a note from your doctor before you travel. Go to your doctor and see if they can give you a note that explains what condition you have, what you are taking for it, the dose you are taking for it, how many pills they have given you for your trip, or how many pills they have prescribed in general, but how many you are taking on your trip. Anything that might be pertinent at all. And I also recommend that you translate it into Italian. If you don't want to pay a translator, that's totally fine. Google Translate will work without an issue for most of it. At least, to the point of, if somebody does search your bag and say, what are these pills? You can hand them the Italian translation, and while there might be a few things off, they'll get the gist of, oh, okay, I got it. It's from your doctor. That's good. So yeah, absolutely. In Italy, there are different controlled substances than there are in the States, in the sense of, I think Italy just has a different, even around ibuprofen, which is not necessarily a controlled substance, but one of the things we stock up in the States is ibuprofen or any sort of painkiller, because, I can go to a grocery store or Target or something and get a giant jar of them, 150, 250 tablets for $8. And here, if I get ibuprofen or acetaminophen or any painkiller, it's usually 8 pills, maybe 16, and it's usually around $1 per pill, sometimes 50 cents per pill. So if if you go in and saying, I'm having a headache, they'll give you 6 ibuprofen in a little blister pack, and they'll charge you like €6 for it. So I always travel with I don't travel with it, but I always bring back a giant jar of ibuprofen. That is not a controlled substance, so you're fine. But anything, I don't know, a lot of times I've taken, in Italy, I had to take prednisone last year, a year or two ago for tinnitus. They thought it could be, if you take a bunch of steroids, maybe it'll go away. It didn't. It was a terrible idea. It was a good idea, but it ended up being terrible. But that's over the counter here. Like, you can go in and if you explain to the pharmacist what you need, they will give you prednisone without a prescription, which kind of tangentially brings me to the fact that pharmacists in Italy have a lot more power, I think, than they do in the States. I think, from what I've heard about the Canadian health system, it seems like Italian pharmacists and Canadian pharmacists are quite similar in the sense that they are allowed to, they're allowed to kind of take their own education and put it to use when it comes to like you coming in with something. I've had pharmacists disagree with what I've been recommended by a doctor, not necessarily prescribed. Prescription's a little different, but when a doctor recommends, you should take this cream, or you should take this pill, or you should take this whatever, I've gone into a pharmacist and they're like, yeah, I wouldn't. You can have reactions with blah 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 blah. Instead, what you should take is this thing. It's cheaper. And so there's a lot more leeway in that sense that you can also, if you're not feeling well, instead of going to the guarda turistici, or instead of going to the emergency room, if you're just like, I kind of just need something maybe to settle my stomach, or you need something for muscle relax, muscle ease, anything like that, you could absolutely go into a pharmacy and just be like, here's my issue. What can you give me for it? And there's a pretty wide range. Like I mentioned, they can give me prednisone, which again is technically needs a doctor prescription in the States. Not technically, 100% needs a doctor's prescription in the States, but in Italy, it doesn't. I think a pharmacist can just give it to you if it's recommended to you, or if they recommend it to you. So if you were coming with your own prescription and you've run out of something, like which is typically, I think, happens when you're doing a big, traveling around Europe for 3 months, but you can't get. I know I don't take any prescription medicine, so if I'm wrong about some of this stuff, this is why. But what I've heard is that certain people, like, you can't get X amount of like Adderall. I know in the States you can't get more than a certain week's or a certain month's supply of Adderall or Ritalin or something like that. It's like, well, no, because you might sell it or you might do something to it. So we can't give you too much. We have to give you a very specific amount. So it can be really difficult to then come to, travel for 3 months without having access to your medication, especially because technically, you can't even you can't have a parent send it to you. You can't, obviously a parent can't potentially fill that prescription until after a date. I don't know how this works. Maybe they can, but I guess my point is you can't send a controlled substance like that to Europe. It will be looked at, be seen as drug trafficking. So definitely don't do that. But what you can do is the first thing, the easiest thing is take your prescription that your doctor has given you, take your bottle or your blister pack or whatever it is of your medication and go to the pharmacy, the nearest pharmacy, and show them and say you need a refill. If they say no, I always just go to the next pharmacy because, again, a lot of this is down to the pharmacist's opinion. It's not necessary. It's a little more nebulous, I think, a little more wiggle room involved in that sort of interaction between like a person and the pharmacist. And it's also a good rule, I think, in Italy. If somebody tells you no, whether it's a conductor getting on a train, whether it's a pharmacist, whoever it is, always just ask somebody else just in case, because I've found personally that Italy seems to be more run by someone's opinion and less by like the law. So if you're trying to get on a train and because you've missed your first one and you're trying to get the second one and the conductor says no, you can always ask like another conductor just to see if you can get like a consensus, because they might be like, oh yeah, of course you can. That other conductor is having a bad day. Same thing with the pharmacist. If you go through prescription, your pill bottle, your blister pack, whatever it is, and your prescription and a doctor's note, which you should have brought anyway, and they say no, just try another one or two. A popular one, if you're in Rome, is in the Vatican, sort of in front of the St. Peter's Square. There's a little pharmacy. It's usually slammed because it doesn't pay the same taxes that other pharmacies in Italy has to, because the Vatican isn't in Italy. I mean, it's in Italy, but it's not part of Italy, I should say. So it doesn't pay the same taxes. So it's a little bit cheaper to get medicine and prescriptions filled there. Really popular space for expats, especially. So that's always a good one if you're in Rome, to just go to the one at the Vatican, does require some waiting, but then they should be able to do it without an issue. If no one can, if you're for some reason you're taking something that is tightly controlled in Italy, you can try to get your doctor, ideally to try to call somebody who speaks English. One of the things that seems to be really popular is trying to find a doctor near you that speaks English and getting your doctor to call this doctor and getting this Italian doctor to then prescribe what you need. Sometimes there's a small fee attached to it, like 10 to 50 euros, and they're like, all right, fine, I'll write you a quick prescription, and it's not much of an issue. There are some doctors that do that, like there's like telemedicine doctors that will do that. There's you can just Google Italy doctor telemedicine prescription, and there will be doctors that will do that again for a small fee. They'll just connect with your doctor back in the States or wherever you're from and see what you need and try to find you the closest. If there isn't, because that's the other issue. Sometimes you might be taking something in the States that they don't have in Italy, not necessarily the same drug, which is absolutely, on the table. There are some drugs in the States that are not sold in Italy. There are some drugs in Italy that are either not sold in the States or just not very well used in the States. So you might be in that sort of situation where you've been prescribed something, but you just cannot simply get it filled in Italy because it doesn't exist or it's not allowed to be sold in Italy. Sometimes it'll be a brand name. If they're thinking like, oh, you need this brand name specifically, I'm sorry, we don't have that. You're going to have to try somewhere else. And then they don't care about, what the active ingredient is. They just care about the brand name. So that's where you can contact an online telehealth, telemedicine doctor, and they'll have to confer with your doctor. But then you should be totally covered. There are definitely other ways to do it. Those are the two easiest ways. And again, it's like, people traveling often will have, not even if you're long-term traveling, sometimes I know people who just left their medicine at home and who brought like everything else, who brought the prescription, who brought their little doctor's note, and who just left their little like pill bottle in the medicine cabinet or on the, dining room table. And they're just like, oh my God, I need that. It's high blood pressure medicine, or it's a beta blocker or something like that. And they're like, I need that for, my trip. It'd be nice to have. So you can always get these, there's always a way to get it. And then last but not least, on that note, even if you have a prescription, you're not paying, like I know in the States, there's the I have a prescription price and this is how much it actually costs, or not I have the prescription price, excuse me. I have insurance price and I don't have insurance price. In Italy, it's not quite the same. It kind of is. Everybody in Italy should have, everybody who lives in Italy who's an Italian has like the sort of, national healthcare coverage, but there's pretty much just one rate and you're going to be paying that. They don't accept, like we've already talked about, they don't accept American health coverage, and by and large, no travel health insurance will offer a prescription refill discount. However, even though things like ibuprofen might be more expensive, other things are really cheap. Like some prescribed drugs and even over-the-counter drugs will be really cheap in comparison. So it kind of just depends on which one you get and basically where you go. Again, the Vatican's a little cheaper than elsewhere in Rome or even elsewhere in Italy. And hopefully this is it. This is the end. Hopefully this has made sense. I keep saying hopefully because honestly, again, this makes sense in my head, but sometimes I realize I say things out loud and I get questioning looks, and I realized I didn't quite connect point A to point B. I just went ahead to point C. So just to very quickly boil it down, travel insurance is simply just, baggage care, baggage covering if you lost a bag, missed a connection, missed a flight, you got sick before flight, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes those are bundled in with your credit card. Sometimes you can purchase that before you actually purchase your flight through something like Delta. Sometimes it's completely standalone. You can go to like the Alliance or Generali website, and as long as you purchase it within 14 days, I think, of leaving, it'll be attached to your trip. Then there's travel health insurance that is just going to cover usually sort of emergency circumstances, not necessarily anything that is elective or routine at all. It typically doesn't cover anything related to the eyes or teeth. That all has to be done privately. If you happen to come here and lose your glasses or something like that and also lost your prescription, then you have to unfortunately just do that privately. There really often is not a coverage option for that. And then finally, emergency rooms, you should be able to go into one as basically as a tourist. You shouldn't have any issue whatsoever. If it's not an emergency, or if the doctor, whoever admitted you, doesn't think it's an emergency, then you will have to be paid a little bit, but they will still see to you. They do not turn anybody away. So it's not like, oh, you have no coverage, I'm sorry, you have to leave. everybody is still seen to. And then, of course, we ended on prescriptions. Essentially, if you're bringing prescriptions, have a doctor's note clarifying what it is. And then if you run out while you're here, first things to do is go to the pharmacy, the farmacia, and see if they can fill it. And if they can't, try to find an online or even in-person doctor who can write you that prescription on the advice of your America, Australian, Canadian, whoever based doctor. So thank you all so much for listening to this episode. I know there's a lot of ums and pauses and weird things that I'm going to try to take out as much as possible, but I realize when Darcy's here, we can bounce off each other a lot more, and there's more downtime, and there's more time to sort of take a deep breath in without sounding super choppy. So I hope this was somewhat comprehensive and cohesive. It's been like the first podcast I've done by myself in like 4 years, first episode I've done by myself in 4 years. So I hope this was somewhat comprehensive and made sense and sort of helped guide you into what you need to be looking for and what works for you. If you'd like to follow, please absolutely would love that. You can hit the follow button, the subscribe button. It does help us out tremendously. You can also visit onlyabag.com if you're interested in some articles. A lot of the stuff we talked about today will be up as an article probably sometime in later October, early November when I have time to write it, and I'll stick it in the description of this episode. And then last but not least, we have an Instagram, Only a Bag Podcast, and you can just follow us there and then send us any messages. If you have any like questions, comments, concerns, you can message us on Instagram, or you can absolutely send us an email, onlyabagpodcast@gmail.com. And thank you all again so very much for listening and for bearing with me as I attempted this podcast. And I hope that you will tune in for the next episode.